Hi, Dori. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm so excited to talk to you because you have so many interesting things that you do for parents. And you actually have on your website that parenting is hard. And I was like, yes, it is, Mindy. It is hard. And I feel like there are some big mistakes that parents very commonly make. So, what is one big mistake that parents make when they are coming into a conflict with their kids?
It's interesting that you asked this question because I just saw this a quote on Instagram actually, and so this ties in really well. And what the coach was saying was that so often what we do is we want to be understood rather than understand. And so we make the mistake and we miss that opportunity to connect with our kids during a conflict. And that creates even greater conflict because we're asking them to do something that we're not doing for them.
Wow, that's actually, that could apply to anybody, really, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wide in its interpretation and application.
So we're trying to get our point across without understanding what theirs was to begin with.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's really, actually, that's quite profound. And thank you for that.
Yes, and I'm so glad that I saw that this morning because that really encapsulates so much of what we see in those parent-child dynamics when there is conflict, that we have a particular perspective and we want our kids to understand our perspective. And at the same time, we're losing the opportunity to see things from their perspective, from their viewpoint.
Yeah, that makes things really complicated too, because I know one of your goals is to help parents raise really resilient kids,
Mhm.
but we also want them to be empathetic. So if we're not using that empathy on our end, how do you raise a resilient kid?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
in your mind, how is one child more resilient than another child? What is it that parents should be trying to do for their kids to get them to that level?
I think the first thing is that we really want to teach our kids awareness. And so that requires us to be aware too, which then goes back to the earlier statement about being listening and not talking as much, really trying to understand their perspective. And so awareness comes in when we're acknowledging what they're feeling and encouraging them to identify what it is they're feeling. It's that emotional intelligence, that EQ factor, because if they don't have a good handle on what they're feeling, then their behavior is going to follow that feeling and they're not going to be able to put the two together. And I think that's the foundation of it, is really understanding first of all what they're feeling, and then that the feeling is separate from any actions that we take. If we're in a situation, and I'm just thinking of my kids when they would have conflicts with friends and they were just like, I'm never going to talk to them again, or I just can't believe that so and so did that. And I said yes, and so I would let them talk because it was important that I listen in that moment and not put my perspective on it for them. And then after they were able to calm down, which this is that I love the neuroscience piece, recognizing that it's important for them to have that moment because they're not, if even if we want to reason with them, they're not in a place to be able to hear that. So allow them to vent and then bring the awareness into it. Okay, so you were feeling that way. And what was it that triggered that? And then you can problem solve from there. But if you don't have a good idea of how you're feeling, then you can't go into those other steps that follow that.
And you would be probably reacting more from that emotional side without the logic of what that's doing to the other person again. Or not.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that resiliency piece, if I were looking at, and this probably is not very fair, I'll be honest, but looking at two kids back to back or side by side, the resilience piece, how would I tell one has more resilience? What would that look like than the other one?
Even in families, we have this, right? I have four children, and some of my kids are quicker to bounce back. And that's what we typically think about, like when we think about resilience, is their ability to bounce back or to handle challenges as they come. And so I'm thinking specifically in my family, I have one child who just rolls with the punches and is very easygoing. And when challenges come up, they handle it that way. They're like, okay, so here's a challenge. And then they're able to think through what steps they can take. They ask for help. They They talk it through and then they move on. And then I have another child who feels every single thing so deeply. I often say they have their tentacles, they're like out into the universe and they feel all of those vibrations and all of the things that are out there. And for that child, it's really important then that I understand that, first of all, about what the emotional needs are, and then go through the process of being aware, helping them to be aware of what it is that they're feeling and how to work through that. And what I really wanted to get to, and I hope that this came through, is that we're all resilient. And I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for that. And it may look different, and the process of getting there may be different in the way that we encourage our kids. Feeling whatever we're feeling in the moment is okay. That doesn't mean that they're not resilient. It's then what they're able to do afterwards. And that's where the work of a parent comes in, is to then say, okay, you were really frustrated there and I can understand that. And then once they're calm, which is the neuroscience piece, going from the emotional part of the brain to the logical part of the brain, then to tap into that and say, okay, what can we do? What can you do next time? Or what are some things that you can look for next time so that maybe you don't get as frustrated? And so they both end up in the same place. It's just the process of that looks a little bit different based on their personalities and their own emotional needs.
Very good. Very good. And that's, I think what we're getting to is actually the DISC personality testing, because I think that's really fascinating. And I will ask you to explain that to other people or to the audience. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is that typically I think DISC is used for business people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's being revised to actually be used more in terms of families and kids. So that's really interesting to understand the difference between the two. And then what each of those, the DISC, stands for would be interesting as well to us.
Certainly. And I was somewhat leading us that way. And at
Yeah.
the same time, though, I think that it really has a lot of application in any relationship that we do have and the dynamics that we see. And I didn't have this when my kids were growing up. And so in terms of resilience, I would get frustrated sometimes because it was my own lack of resilience as well, because I didn't know how to help my kids work through these different situations because they had different reactions to them. And of course, my response to my one child, who was very easygoing and kind of did all the things that we would check off, like, oh, yeah, that's a resilient kid. It was easier in some ways, but at the same time, that wasn't fair for me to then think that my other child wasn't resilient, because it looked different. And it was a different process that they took. And so then using the DISC model of human behavior has been really helpful. And and it has been revised so that it can look at the parent and child and what their strengths are. And that's what I really find so helpful and meaningful in those interactions, because when a parent can understand their own personality traits and why they do what they do, and what's underlying their responses to their children, then that is so huge, because then they can adapt and then they can change their approach as well, because they have that knowledge, and knowledge is empowering. And then for our kids, what a gift that we're giving them, then to be able to understand it's okay that you're sensitive. Like, I was labeled very sensitive when I was a child. And sometimes I felt badly about that. And so our kids can then, because they may see that they handle things differently than their siblings or friends, or they may have high expectations of themselves that they should handle it as well as an adult would. And this gives them that opportunity to understand themselves as well, and that these are really gifts and strengths that they can build on, and that will serve them well throughout their lives.
I am highly sensitive as well, and but still like to have some drive. My family surrounding me is highly driven. And so when we watch movies, we get in situations where it's an emotional thing for me. I am fighting, trying to hide all my emotions because I know their responses can be, oh, come on. And truly, if you're a parent trying to parent a child who is so different from you, that could cause just the struggle right there. And the fact that you're expecting them to respond the way that you would, but that's not their process.
Absolutely. And I can say that I felt similarly growing up and even in my family because I do have a sensitive child. And so I understand that. And I also put on my own experiences onto that particular child as well because I was giving her the messages that I had received. And so that's where it's been helpful for me then to dive into this myself and have a better understanding of this. And that has really reduce conflict and stress in my relationship with that child that I don't have to say to her, suck it up. The things that were told to me, suck it up, or you don't have to cry over everything, or whatever those messages were that we received.
Yeah. So tell us about each of the letters in the disc personality.
Yes, absolutely. So what I love about DISC and is that, and especially as it's been applied now to the family dynamics, to family interactions, is it really is helpful to understand. It's easy to understand and easy to apply, which really makes such a huge difference. And I'm trying to get to my little notes here. So um, I'm missing what that's because it's right here. I'm sorry. I have my notes so that I can
You're
talk
fine.
a little bit. Yeah. So the D is really stands for dominant, and you may hear other things as well, other descriptors, but D stands for dominant. These are the doers, those ones that are really driven. These are our kids who may look they're always busy, they're active or bossy. Sometimes we can look at that and see that because they like to be like they like challenges and they like to have choices and they like to have control. So they're the ones who are driving the bus and you're going to go wherever, whatever destination they want you to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a child like that. So I know the struggles with that is that struggles in the relationship. How then do you help them to steer where you would like them to go so that you can have a common goal? And I stands for inspiring. And so these are the kids, they've never met a stranger. They're the social bees, the social butterflies. They're bringing light and all kinds of fun to they're the ones that you really enjoy being around. And so they're influential. They love to interact with other people and they tend to be very popular. They have a lot of friends. And both of those that I just mentioned, those are the outgoing personalities. So these are the ones who we might consider to be extroverts, and they really gain their energy from being around other people. And then we have the wonderful, and I think that this is you and me, the wonderful S's who are the supportive ones. They're steady, they're a little bit more reserved. They're all about their people. They enjoy supporting others. And sometimes that sensitivity comes in there with because they want everyone to get along. They really don't like conflict. So they try to smooth things over. And so if there was a phrase that we could use for them, can't we all just get along? And that would be them. And then C stands for cautious. And these are the kids who are the ones who tend to think a little bit more. They're the information gatherers. They're conscientious. They try to give their very best. They might be the ones who are slow to respond. And they're doing that because they want to have all of their facts in place. And so that they can act out of a sense of understanding and really from that knowledge base that they've gained. And so they really value excellence. They really value quality answers. And so sometimes that can be difficult for us if we're, in a hurry and we want to give a quick answer. And they're like, but why? So tell me, but I want to know more. Why is that? And so they ask a lot of questions to gain the knowledge that they need to be able to make decisions.
Yeah. I can see how that would be hard even in a family having a D and an I together or a D and a C together.
Yes, it can be quite a ride.
Yeah. Yeah, but it would also help to explain some of the conflicts that would develop out of things that maybe you as a parent were like, I don't, why is this an issue? Because if they're processing their experience of what's going on is completely different, that's a big deal.
Yeah, because they're seeing things from a totally different lens. Their perspective, their viewpoint is very different than, and that can happen between spouses. It can happen between one spouse and a child, because I know that there are sometimes in families and with parents that I'm working with, they'll say to me that their husband or their wife is really struggling with one particular child and they don't know how to help. And so when I think that we have this framework that we can put on things, then it at least allows them to start having the language to be able to even discuss that
That
and
makes a
work
lot of
through what
sense.
they can do.
Okay, I have to ask this just because this is how my brain works sometimes. I've taken tests, personality tests before, and totally manipulated them. How does this work as far as kids go? Or how do you get like a genuine, true read?
That's an interesting question because you're right. Because I think that for us, I've taken some of those other assessments as well. And I'm like, oh, I really want it to be this.
Yeah,
And you can
yeah.
sometimes read like beforehand, oh, if I answer it this way, then it's going to give me this result. And I think that the best determination of this is you can see if it's not quite accurate too. And so if they're trying to for it to turn out a certain way, then you'll be able to tell because it won't necessarily match with what you're seeing, what these behaviors are. And I can say in my family, my youngest child had taken, I'd asked all the kids to take this at some point because I had an idea. I just wanted to see if it was true. And so he was disappointed that he didn't have more D. And so what I shared with him, and I share this with the kids and with the parents before they take their assessments, that to try to be as honest as they can, because then you'll really see what is driving the behavior that you're seeing. And so when you can do that and you can be honest, then we can work together to strengthen those areas that may be a little bit lower. Because in this case, and with the Graham and their Briggs Meyer or Myers Briggs and some of those, we can have all of these characteristics. So we're not just a D or we're not just an I or an S or a C, but we're a combination of those things. And what it also gives us too is that when we're dealing with environmental stressors, it can bring out other aspects of our personality that would not normally be natural for us. And so then that's good information for us to have as well, because then that can be a place of stress for us and then eventually burnout because we're having to utilize an aspect of our personality that isn't our primary way of responding.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because if you're in a stressful situation, you try what works usually, and if it doesn't, then you move on to something new and more creative, right? So,
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And all of these personality types can be leaders. And there are examples in our world of people very, who are very amazing leaders, even as an S or a C. It's also recognizing what things can trip us up as well. For instance, and I can speak to this as an S, I'm very kind hearted. And so sometimes then it's like I overgive. And so it's recognizing that, okay, this is a wonderful attribute. And at the same time, I need to recognize that sometimes I might need to say no. And so those are areas that we can grow in.
absolutely. Now, you use this DISC personality test in your 90-day parenting blueprint plans as well, right?
Correct. Mhm.
Love for you to talk about that too.
Certainly. So the whole basis of it is the DISC assessment. And so that's what the parents and the children start with. And so what happens from there is once we get the results, then I plug it into an interactive guide. And that is really, really a cool component of this because then they can see themselves in a chart next to their child. And for instance, if you have someone who's a high D, like you talked about, and then their child is a high I, and they're like, my child is so impulsive, and I want to be on this schedule. And you can see where the conflict, that gap is. And then that gives them the basis of where we can go then in our following sessions. So this is like the preliminary part of that 90-day program, which is then called the Parenting Blueprint, which is a self-paced video program that goes over each of these personality types in depth. and then talking about how do you meet those emotional needs? What are your styles of communicating? What types of responses do you give? How do you meet the emotional needs of yourself as well as listening and understanding your child so that you can connect and overcome some of these situations that we find ourselves in? Because if we don't understand the root cause of or what's underlying a behavior, we can then oftentimes be offended by it.
So true. So true. And I'm trying to remember, I know with the toolkit, there were the videos. Is there also like one-on-one coaching as part of it as well?
There is, yes. And
Yeah.
so that's something that we talk about in the beginning as well. I do include three individual coaching sessions. So we'll go over, first, we'll have one call that will go over all the results. And then after that, we have three after particular modules in the program. And that way we can discuss what's going on. What are you finding? Where are you feeling like you need some more support? Is there something you don't understand? And then we can also bring in the kids as well to help them to better understand maybe where their parents are coming from or where they are coming from, because that can also be a source of conflict for them, is that they're like feeling like they can never be enough and they're constantly disappointing their parents. And we don't want anybody. And this is what I really love about this program. It's really focused on the strengths and where there might be areas that we can tweak so that they can grow together.
That's amazing. I was actually going to ask you, and maybe this is still a valid question. Does the whole family have to be willing to do it? Let's say you have four people in your family and three of the four want to do it. Can you still go through the program?
Absolutely. Oftentimes it's one parent and the children. And so I think that there's still a lot of things that can be implemented, and just the awareness that you have and the ability to see and recognize the differences helps. I had a mom a couple of months ago who went through the program, and her husband didn't want to go through it because he said that he thought it was just basically nonsense. And she went through it, and it really helped her to see where her husband was being triggered. And so then it allowed them to have conversations without him really being aware that where she was getting this information, but it allowed her to be listening and to be observing so that she could then connect with him.
That's awesome. But I did think about parents like a relationship issue, and I thought about if you have a child that maybe is different than everybody in the family and is causing unintentional issues, but that would be a similar situation.
Absolutely, yes, because our kids are so unique. And so this allows us to celebrate their uniqueness and really understand what's behind it. And I'm just going to say the two most difficult times that we think of anyway is like the toddler time and then the tween and teens. And this gives a really great perspective on them individually. And then I also, when we talk about, this is what I blend in with, like weave into it, the neuroscience, so then they can understand brain development and what's going on in that brain of theirs, because sometimes it can feel like our children have been possessed by aliens, especially when they get to be those tweens and teens and they're like impulsive and illogical, and you're just looking and you're like, where did my sweet child go?
It can be really frustrating. Absolutely.
Yes, it's frustrating. And anything that you say, it's like being shot down, or they immediately, you feel like the curtain goes down and they don't want to engage and they just stomp off to your room, and all you did was just say hello. How was your day?
There's too many words.
Yes, yes. Maybe hello, day.
Oh, that's too funny. I've heard so many things in that realm with the teens, and honestly, toddlers and teens are very similar in a lot of ways. So I think it's ironic those are the two struggles. But yeah, I think that having those conversations and having the outlet of being able to read situations a little bit more clearly, being able to have responses maybe that aren't something that's going to be a trigger for the other person, that's huge.
Yes, and I think it also helps us not to take things so personally.
Yeah.
And I can say, as being someone who's sensitive and that supportive type, when I would make overtures to my kids, whether like when they were toddlers and I'm like trying to teach them something and they were getting frustrated and they would have those just meltdowns, or similarly when they were teens and we were going through similar things. And I would take that very personally. I'm like, I'm trying so hard. But what I was finding was I was trying to meet my own need and I wasn't looking at what their needs were. And so having this information, I wish I had it then because it would have taken away some of the angst that I felt. And the days that I would go in and I would just shut my door and I would cry in my room because my feelings were hurt.
Yeah, it's so true. I was thinking actually with the all of the texting and the devices that are used for communication now, especially as they get older, it still would be really helpful because you still nothing says mad like a text, right? You just don't
Yes.
know how to read into some of them sometimes and it comes across differently. So even that perspective of knowing, okay, this is the way they think, this is the way they're going to communicate. It's okay, it's not personal. That's huge.
Yes, and you're right because we can't always tell because we're lacking that face to face, so we can't read their facial expression or their body language or the tone or listen to their tone of voice. So we're getting it sometimes a very, which is what they do is they use shorthand, but is they're very direct a lot of times or abrupt in what they share. And so it that's hard when you might have poured out your heart. I love you. I hope you have a great time. And then it's okay.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, all
Okay. I'll read that as happy. I love it. Okay, let's say you're a mom who or a dad who's in a situation where they are struggling. They want to do something that's going to make a change. And they are listening to this podcast right now. And as soon as they get done listening, what are a few things that they can do to make life less conflictual and more enjoyable for themselves?
yes. One of the things that I would say is first of all, I have something that they can download and I'll give that to you and it's called the Parenting Blueprint Toolkit. And so it goes over some of what we just talked about today so that they can start to pay attention to things about their child and about themselves. Does my child look like this? Do they respond like this? And so that will give them some beginnings anyway into understanding becoming more aware of those personality types in their home. And then the next thing is that I would really encourage parents at this stage to really look just to be present, to really look at what's going on in the home and just be aware of the dynamics so that they have a good understanding of what they're really struggling with. Because sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed, we can say it's everything, but it might not be. It might be certain times of the day. For instance, maybe the mornings are really difficult. And so then you can spend a little bit of time from there figuring out, okay, so how can I make this part better so that we all get out of the house less stressed, not yelling at one another, deciding that we don't like each other as we're walking out the door. And then that we stew on that all day, right? And that's not a good way to start off the day. Or it could be bedtime or any transition. So it's just, I think, really focusing on awareness of personality type, of the types of struggles that you're having, is at particular times of the day. And then you can make a plan from there. But if you don't know what you're dealing with and you're just feeling this overall overwhelm, then you're going to feel stuck.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Great advice. One thing I want to make sure that they get is definitely your toolkit, but also where can they get a hold of you easily and where can they find you?
Certainly. So you can find me on my website, which is mindygreencoaching.com. And there's lots of information there. I have a blog, I have a newsletter that they can sign up for. So there's a lot of support that comes monthly just through free resources. And if they would like to find out more information on the Parenting Blueprint program itself, there's information there. They can reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and it's all Mindy Green Coaching.
Awesome. And it's green, no E at the end.
Yes, just like the color.
Okay, perfect.
Mhm.
Mindy, is there any last advice that you have for parents as we end our podcast?
The biggest thing I would say is that your kids don't need you to be a perfect parent. They just need you to be a present parent. And we put such, sometimes we can put such pressure on ourselves because we want to do things really well. And just being there and showing up is the most important gift that you can ever give your kids.
I love that. And being a sensitive person, I almost cried. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time today, Mindy. I can't wait for people to get a hold of you.
Yes, me too. And thank you for having me today.
Absolutely.